Hello, and welcome to PCB Chat, where we talk with experts across the printed circuit design, manufacturing, and electronics supply chain fields. I'm Chelsea Drysdale, Chief Content Officer of the Printed Circuit Engineering Association. I'm joined by Mike Buteau, President of PCEA. Environment issues have been front and center in electronics for decades. Most engineers today remember when the restriction of the use of hazardous substances in electronics, or RoHS, first went into effect in July 2006. Today's guest has been helping electronics designers and manufacturers work their way through this complicated and changing set of requirements since the beginning. Michael Kirschner of Design Chain Associates is a product environmental compliance and safety expert and circular economy thought leader. He's going to update us on the status of RoHS, including the possibility, am I getting too far ahead, that it might be nearing its own end of life. Hello, Mike, and welcome to PCB Chat.
Hi, Chelsea. Thank you for having me.
On your LinkedIn page, which we follow, you have called attention to the ongoing public consultation period of RoHS, which I believe ends later this month. What is your general sense of the EC's environmental goals with this latest comment period?
Well, thank you, first of all, for following my page on LinkedIn. The goals, the European Commission's goals, I think they're going to be bringing RoHS into, and by the way, RoHS, 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 however you want to pronounce it, they've never given us any guidelines. I think they're going to bring it into alignment with the Circular Economy Action Plan. And just what they're going to do should have been defined, I think, in their Circular Electronics Initiative, which was supposed to be published a few months ago, but still hasn't been released. So, to answer the question, I kind of would have to look back at the call for evidence, which is really what you're asking about here. This is the call for the open stakeholder consultation that's ongoing right now. It's almost over, I think.
I think I saw March 14th as the deadline.
Yeah, March 14th. So there's not much time. They're required, the commission was required by the RoHS directive to, in Article 24, paragraph 2 specifically, to carry out a general review of the directive and present a report to the European Parliament and Council, accompanied by, if appropriate, a legislative proposal. That was supposed to be in place by July 22nd last year. They did get the general review that a couple of consultancies produced, but they did not get a legislative proposal. Right? That's what they're working on now. And they've gotten a lot of input and complaints over the last decade about, 2011 65 EU. So I think they've identified in this call for evidence things they want to deal with, or they believe that they have to deal with, like scope problems, which they've addressed. And there's still a few outstanding. The FAQ has not been revised since 2012. It's kind of at this point, hopelessly out of date and really needs expansion in certain areas. One of the big ones that I've run across, and so have others, is the discussion of what is meant by large scale, particularly when it's addressing large scale installations. The biggest issues there's two big issues, the exemption renewal process and the substance review process. The exemption renewal process is probably the one that's affected most people, most manufacturers. They initially had 18 months from the time the exemption renewal application date ended to come up with an answer about whether they were going to actually renew the exemption. And that, year and a half turned into years. So that was very optimistic. The first time around, they got 80 some odd exemption renewal applications. So, and now we're seeing again the same problem, because we've got exemptions that we're supposed to, that are going to be expiring in 2024, and we don't have a clear indication of when those, of whether those exemptions are going to be renewed or not. The substance review process, that's challenging as well, because we don't have a clear understanding of what the methodology is for selection and evaluation. We have a draft process from the commission, but not an actual process. And here we are 20 years into RoHS. And it's unclear to a lot of people why it differs from the REACH process, which is pretty well described, the evaluation part of REACH. And then we've also got the EcoDesign directive, which all of a sudden, 2019 bans an entire class of halogenated flame retardants from enclosures for monitors, displays, and televisions. So there's multiple different paths for a substance to get restricted and affect an electronic product. And then we do have, the RoHS process itself, as I mentioned, which is fairly unclear, but it looks like it's going to result in a couple of substances getting restricted at some point here in the near future, perhaps under RoHS 3 or whatever replaces it. One of which is going to affect the printed circuit board industry, and that's tetrabromobisphenol A. If that gets restricted, it may or may not have an impact. I don't see it having a significant impact because TBBPA is not present in printed circuit boards since it's reacted to form the epoxy for board material, as well as mold compounds for ICs and other devices where it's still being used. It's just any remaining level of the substance can't exceed whatever the limit is, probably 1,000 ppm. Those are kind of what I see as the big issues, but they also say enforcement has been challenging, particularly with e-commerce. And then there are certain unclear and outdated provisions on spare parts or scope, and insufficient provisions to support the circular economy, e.g. for secondary resources. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question.
As a follow-up, the EC says this version initiative will simplify and increase the efficiency of the current rules and improve their enforcement. How so?
Well, that's in one of the options they're suggesting as a possible outcome of this process. They say they're going to clarify and improve the exemption criteria and process, clarify and improve the substance restriction trigger criteria and process, both of which I mentioned before. Ensure coherence with other legislation, primarily REACH and EcoDesign, and improve implementation and enforcement. How they're going to improve enforcement is unclear to me, actually. Yeah, I'm not on that side of the fence, of course. But by making it a regulation, for instance, I think that could make it easier, because then all the member states have essentially the same regulation to look after. They may have their own enforcement regulations separately still, but at least they'll have the same regulation. I think in order to improve that, they would have to specify more common enforcement criteria and mechanisms across all the member states, because right now they're very different. Some places you can go to jail, other places you might just get fined the same offense.
What's the proposed timeline for the latest rev?
Well, according to the Commission work program for 2022, the revision of RoHS is planned for the last quarter of 2022. So sometime later this year. Whether they hit that, we don't know.
In a post on LinkedIn, you suggested the EC could eliminate RoHS. What are the chances of that? If it does, what are the implications for the market?
That's a good question. So I didn't really suggest that. The commission did. So they gave us several possible options. One of which is just repealing the RoHS directive and incorporating its provisions into the REACH regulation. I don't think that's going to happen because they're two completely different regulatory mechanisms. REACH has a much broader horizontal scope. It regulates chemicals across virtually, no, not entirely, but almost all applications of them. RoHS is in the electronics vertical, period. RoHS restricts at the homogeneous level, and REACH, at least the disclosure aspect of it, in the authorization part, the candidate for list of substances of very high concern, that's at the article level, which is a different level than homogeneous materials. We've all had to learn all these crazy terms here. And the restriction mechanism under REACH is just all over the map. It's very dependent upon what the chemical is and how it's used, where it's used, and what the markets are, etc. The other possible way they could repeal the RoHS directive is addressing product requirements related to the environmentally sound recovery and disposal of electrical and electronic waste under sustainable products legislation, i.e., in the context of the Sustainable Products Initiative revising the EcoDesign directive. So now this is an option where they tie together RoHS with the EcoDesign directive, framework directive, which is 2009/125/EC. Implementing measures are written for that for specific product verticals that historically have only focused on energy, but the EcoDesign framework directive allowed them much greater latitude about what they could address under that. And in the past few years, as I noted before, for monitors, displays, and TVs, they, for instance, added a ban on halogenated flame retardants. They're also addressing other aspects of materials and circular product design that are beyond energy and energy use to other implementing measures. To the extent that they're actually specifying functionality for products. In some cases, your dishwasher has to have a specific mode with a specific name. Now, for instance, it's pretty wild. They also say they could just maintain the RoHS directive as it stands and update the FAQ. I think that would be a big mistake because the RoHS directive has problems. They say they could simplify and clarify the RoHS directive by introducing and revising legislative measures and other measures. And that's what I was referring to before, where I rattled off clarifying, improving the exemption criteria process, substance restriction triggers, etc. That one's, I think, fairly likely. They say they could transform the RoHS directive into a regulation. That also is fairly likely. So I think those two are really the most likely approach moving forward, as opposed to just wiping it out altogether or incorporating it into REACH or leaving it as is.
One criticism of RoHS is that analysis testing is burdensome and lacks consistent measures, thus the potential for discrepancies. Would this issue be resolved if the substance of very high concern requirement replaced RoHS, as some have suggested?
Well, so first of all, testing's not a requirement of RoHS. And disclosure, particularly at the article level, which is the SVHC requirement, for those of us not based in the EU and subject to the authorization aspect of REACH, where SVHC disclosure ultimately can become a ban unless you're authorized to use the SVHC. And that's just not the same as restriction at the homogeneous material level, which is the RoHS approach. So that's just not going to happen. I'm not sure who is thinking that the SVHC requirement is going to replace RoHS. That's unlikely. Testing is just not something that I think is the right approach. The preferable method is to simply get the compliance documentation from your supplier. And I think testing is an appropriate mechanism to keep your suppliers honest or to verify their information as needed, but it's not really a solid or reliable primary mechanism to ensure compliance against the RoHS directive requirements, which are at the homogeneous material level. Testing is simply not going to get you the data you need, including the detailed exemption information. At that level, at a cost that's reasonable, I mean, it's going to cost like $200 to test, at least, to test a part to even see if it's got RoHS substances in it. If you have a complex product with thousands of unique parts, that can really exceed a rational amount of money. And even if it doesn't, even if you've only got a handful of parts, it's unclear to me what testing what testing gets you. You have to do it for every lot of every component that's used in your product over time, unless your supplier can guarantee lot-to-lot consistency, and you believe them. And if they have process control and you believe them, then why are you testing? So I think people need to reread IEC 63000, which is the harmonized standard, defined really by industry and approved by the European Commission to replace the testing requirement, which is defined by the new legislative framework 768/2008/EC. Because testing, again, is just not rational. This is why manufacturers post their material composition or post sometimes useful, very often useless certificates of compliance on their websites. So you don't have to test, but sometimes you may have to inquire a bit more deeply of the suppliers to make sure that what they're giving you is actually meaningful. That's another whole story.
What can we expect in terms of a ripple effect to other markets if or when this version of RoHS is ratified?
That's a good question. It may influence them. It may not. Countries who are trying to become EU member states will generally be more likely to implement whatever changes the Commission makes. But others, like China, are under no such obligation, and they're going to aggressively remind you of their sovereignty when you ask them about it. So, yeah, they don't have any obligation to do so.
If I remember right, you've started your career as an electronics designer.
I've done that sort of work. Yeah, I've had a long and sordid career, mostly in semiconductor quality and reliability and component engineering, but I've also done electronic design work, software development, all kinds of things.
I'm guessing the term circular economy wasn't really part of your vocabulary back then.
No, definitely not.
So the idea, if I understand it right, the idea of the circular economy is to extend the useful life of products and materials by creating these loops of the materials and products circulating in the economy. So if this is the end of RoHS, and it doesn't seem likely it is just based on the conversation here, what does that mean for the circular economy? And in your opinion, does the alphabet soup of other regulations, in particular WEEE, enhance that loop as well as they could?
Great question. Great question. I don't think we has been as successful as the commission has expected it to be. That's why I think we're seeing them talk about the circular economy. They have been less than successful in achieving their goals for the percent of e-waste that's actually properly recycled. They're somewhere around 40% right now, according to their own data. And I think they expected it to be above 60% by now, but even that's not enough. Fundamentally, we're still using the classical linear product life cycle process to both design products and manufacture them. And really, manufacturers haven't made any changes to process or design to products to make them more recyclable or more reusable. They've just, paid the amount of money that the recyclers are asking and the member states are asking, and said, "Okay, it's your problem now." So that's what the circular economy is about. Is okay. We've had enough of this. We've got this Green New Deal and the European Green Deal, right? The New Deal was FDR's. Maybe we need a Green New Deal. I think that's AOC's now. But they're in this, like I said, the Circular Electronics Initiative was kind of supposed to give us a sense of how this is all going to change, because we do have all these alphabet soups regulations, as you said, that affect electronics in kind of a piecemeal and different manner. I think they're going to tie this all together, or try to tie this all together, to be more sensible and coherent, rather than have, we have RoHS, we have REACH, we have EcoDesign, we have the POPs regulation, we have packaging, we have batteries, all of these different regulations impacting one aspect or another of an electronic product and of the design of that product. I don't know how they plan to make it more coherent, but I certainly expect to see changes to a regulation that simply bans substances like RoHS, to make it more circular. For instance, if you simply ban a substance and don't control what the replacement is, you may or may not get a more environmentally preferable substance from the manufacturer. Manufacturers are generally going to do what's least expensive and most expedient. And if that least expensive, most expedient alternative is not the most environmentally preferable, or if it's about the same as what already is what's being banned, then, there you go. And that's happened. That's happened a couple times with RoHS specifically. It turns out that, for instance, the tin lead solder LCA versus the tin silver copper LCA are about the same. You're really not getting a significant improvement in environmental performance from going to tin silver copper when you look at the whole life cycle of tin, of silver, and copper in that application. And versus tin and lead, according to the US EPA's LCA of them all and the analysis of that LCA information. Another example, and these are regrettable substitutions because you're just going to have to replace them again. We replaced decabromo-diphenyl ether with, when it was banned by RoHS, with decabromo-diphenyl ethane, both extremely similar molecules. The ethane is a drop-in replacement in most ABS plastics for the ether. And it's pretty similar in terms of not only functionality, but in terms of toxicity. So Canada is actually banning that now. They've gotten ahead of the EU. So, unless they control these other substances and really drive the industry towards improving the environmental performance, they're simply going to be putting the industry on and themselves on a treadmill, and we won't be able to get off. So hopefully they'll be a little smarter, I think, about how they implement the RoHS recast and how they implement the circular economy requirements moving forward. It's going to be very challenging for them and for the industry.
So if listeners have a takeaway from all of this, what should it be?
Hold on tight. I think if you hear this and you have a chance to submit a comment to the European Commission, do it by the 14th. If you don't have a chance to do that, keep your eye on this process, because there will be, I expect, another stakeholder consultation once we see the draft of the RoHS recast, which will be RoHS 3. I think that will be the term of art for it. In addition, just in general, manufacturers have to take this stuff seriously. Manufacturers are not immovable objects, but I think the European Commission is an unstoppable force, right? So they will win, but they need coherent feedback from the industry. They really do, because they're not experts in what we do. And I think they have a lot more power and leeway than they probably should have in this space, because there is no good counterbalance to them. When they have hundreds and hundreds of toxicologists working at the European Chemicals Agency, as well as the JRC, the Joint Research Center, they have an enormous amount of expertise within the Commission to study this stuff and deal with it. And industry doesn't. The electronics industry, regardless of how huge it is, has those resources really limited at to the largest of the large manufacturers. So, and we don't have a separate think tank that focuses on this area to help guide the industry and help the industry move toward where it's going to need to, as well as provide coherent feedback to the Commission and other governments that think they know what's best. In a lot of ways they do, but in a lot of ways I think they need some guidance. We've produced products for a very, very long time without thinking about the environment, and we're kind of paying for it now. So that's really where we have to focus, and governments are forcing us down that path, whether we like it or not. We have to accept that. Manufacturers have to start spending the money, spending the resources, and really taking it seriously. Otherwise, it's just going to be more and more pain.
Thank you so much for your insights today and for joining us on PCB Chat. Our guest has been Michael Kirschner of Design Chain Associates. You can follow him on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/designchain or look him up at designchainassociates.com. For PCB Chat, this is Chelsea Drysdale. Have a nice day.